There are two kinds of truths in the world: the ones you live by, and the ones that are living a life without you, waiting. For 32 years, I had lived by a single, unimpeachable truth. My father, Richard Morgan, was the best man I knew. He was my North Star, the architect of not just Chicago's skyline, but of my entire moral framework. And on a crisp October afternoon, that truth felt as solid and unyielding as the marble columns of the courthouse I had just conquered. The gavel had fallen like a thunderclap, sealing a $75 million victory for my firm. My mind, however, wasn't on the money. It was on the phone call I was about to make. I pushed past the jubilant handshakes from my partners, my fingers already dialing the number I knew better than my own. He picked up on the second ring. "Tell me something good, Ava." His voice was a rich baritone, the kind of voice that could calm investors and charm city planning committees with equal ease. "We won," I said, a grin finally breaking through my professional composure. I could hear the smile in his response, the deep, rumbling pride that was my favorite sound in the world. "That's my girl." I never had a doubt. Not for a second. That was it. That was the real victory. The praise from my bosses was a formality. My father's pride was the verdict that mattered. "Dinner tonight," he declared, not asked. "The usual place. 8 o'clock. We're celebrating. Your mother is already planning her toast." The restaurant was a symphony of quiet success. Low lighting gleamed off dark wood, and the air hummed with the hushed conversations of people who didn't need to raise their voices to be heard. My mother, Ellen, looked radiant, her elegance a perfect complement to the surroundings. She squeezed my hand the moment I sat down, her eyes sparkling. "My brilliant daughter," she whispered, and for a moment we were the perfect picture. The proud, loving parents and their accomplished, grateful child. My father ordered for my mother without asking, knew the wine I would prefer before I looked at the list, and regaled us with a story about a stubborn client that had us all laughing. This was our ritual, the well-worn, comfortable rhythm of the Morgan family. A family built on a foundation of success, love, and absolute, unshakable trust. The waiter placed the leather billfold on the table with a respectful nod. My father reached for it with a familiar, confident gesture I had seen 1,000 times. He opened his wallet, a worn piece of leather that I'd given him for his 50th birthday, but the card he pulled from it was wrong. It was a crisp, unfamiliar slice of black plastic, with a bank logo I didn't recognize. My lawyer's brain, trained to spot discrepancies, kicked into gear automatically. It was a minor detail, a meaningless anomaly, but it was there. "New card?" I asked, keeping my tone light, a casual observation to fill the silence as he signed the slip. I watched his hand move, the pen gliding across the paper. He smiled, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Bonus miles, honey," he said, his voice as smooth as the wine we'd just finished. "All for our next vacation to Italy." My mother clapped her hands together softly, her eyes lighting up. "Oh, Richard. Florence?" But I wasn't looking at her. I was looking at my father, and for the first time in my 32 years, I saw a flicker of something in his eyes that wasn't for me or my mother. It was a brief, shadow-like shift, a glance toward the exit that lasted no longer than a heartbeat. He looked like a man who had just remembered an appointment he was late for. Then, just as quickly, it was gone. He was my father again, charismatic and untouchable, teasing my mother about her shopping plans. I smiled and joined the conversation, talking about the Uffizi Gallery and the merits of Tuscan leather. The moment was over, the anomaly filed away. And yet, it lingered. A tiny, dissonant note in an otherwise perfect symphony. A piece of data that didn't fit. My father was a man of routine and loyalty, in his business and his banking. For him to open a new, random credit card was as out of character as him showing up to a meeting in a ripped t-shirt. I told myself it was nothing. I had just spent 6 months in a grueling legal battle, my mind trained to see threats and inconsistencies where none existed. That night, I went to sleep the proudest daughter in Chicago. But a small, cold question had lodged itself in the back of my mind, a question I couldn't yet bring myself to articulate. Since when did my father, a man of meticulous habit, need a new lie? A lawyer's mind is a dangerous thing to bring home. It doesn't switch off when you hang up your coat. It's a machine built for one purpose: to sift through chaos and find the single, hidden thread that, once pulled, will unravel everything. For 2 weeks, I had actively suppressed that machine, telling myself the incident with the credit card was nothing. It was fatigue, the phantom limb of a concluded case, my brain still searching for an adversary. But the machine was just idling, waiting for new data. And it arrived, as it did every year, in a shoebox my father unceremoniously dropped on his mahogany desk. Tax season. The one time of year my meticulously organized legal mind was not just welcome, but required. It was our tradition. For one Saturday every April, I would descend upon my parents' quiet, book-lined study and bring order to their financial year. My mother would supply us with coffee and pastries, humming contentedly, proud of her 2 methodical Morgans. My father, brilliant in architecture but a disaster with paperwork, would sit with me, providing context for receipts and chuckling at his own disorganization. It was comfortable. It was normal. It was the last time anything would ever feel normal again. "It's all in there, Ava," he said, tapping the box. "The usual mess. I'd be lost without you." He smiled that easy, charismatic smile, and my lingering unease from that night at the restaurant almost evaporated. Almost. I started sorting, my hands moving with practiced efficiency. Business expenses in one pile, personal in another, charitable donations here, medical receipts there. Then my fingers brushed against a statement that was too crisp, too new. It was from the same bank as the black card. My heart gave a small, sharp knock against my ribs. My first instinct, the daughter's instinct, was to put it aside. It was his private account. But the lawyer in me, the relentless, pattern-seeking machine, took over. I told myself it was for the taxes. I had to account for any interest income. It was a perfect, professional lie. I unfolded the paper. My eyes scanned the columns, a river of mundane transactions: groceries, gas, a subscription to an architectural journal. And then I saw it. It wasn't a purchase. It was a wire transfer. $5,000, dated the 1st of the month. The recipient line was just an account number. My eyes jumped to the next page, the previous month's statement. There it was again. 1st of the month. $5,000. I worked my way backward through the stack. Every single month for the past year. A quiet, automatic payment of $5,000, totaling $60,000 for the year. A cold knot of dread began to tighten in my stomach. Who were we supporting? An estranged family member? An old friend down on his luck? My father was generous, but he was also transparent. He and my mother made their charitable donations together. This was different. This was silent. This was hidden. Then I saw the location of the recipient bank: Portland, Oregon. My mind raced, trying to build a logical, innocent framework around the facts. Portland? We knew no one in Portland. Morgan Architecture had no projects, no suppliers, no presence of any kind in Portland. I would know. I'd helped him draft partnership agreements for the last decade. The lie from the restaurant echoed in my ears. Bonus miles, honey. A lie designed to stop a question before it could be asked. I tried to focus, to push the thoughts away, my fingers feeling numb as I continued to sort the shoebox. Then I found the travel receipts. A folder labeled business expenses. Inside were the stubs for 4 round-trip flights from the past year. All from Chicago to Portland. All for him. All for 2-day midweek trips. And on each expense report, in my father's familiar, elegant script, were the words, business development. The 2 sets of documents lay on the polished desk like evidence in a trial I didn't want to prosecute. The silent monthly payments to a ghost in Oregon. The quarterly business trips to the same city where his firm did no business. The pieces didn't just fit together. They slammed into place with the force of a physical blow. This wasn't a charity case. This wasn't helping a friend. This was a sustained, expensive, and meticulously concealed part of his life. The shoebox, once a symbol of our comfortable family tradition, now felt like a coffin filled with secrets. The tiny, dissonant note I'd heard in the restaurant had swelled into a deafening chord. My father, my moral compass, had a secret life, and I, his loving daughter, had just become the unwilling investigator assigned to the case. For a week, the account number and the city of Portland sat in my mind like unexploded ordnance. To investigate felt like a betrayal. To ignore it felt like a lie. In the law, we have a term, willful blindness. It's the conscious act of avoiding knowledge of a crime, a legal shield that offers no actual protection. I had built my career on shredding that shield in court, on proving that not knowing was a choice. And here I was, choosing it every morning when I woke up. But the machine in my head, the one my father had paid to build through years of law school, wouldn't stay quiet. It demanded an answer. What do you do when the one person you trust above all others becomes a person of interest in the wreckage of your own peace of mind? I did what I was trained to do. I compartmentalized. I treated it like a case. At my desk, surrounded by the legitimate hum of my professional life, I told myself it was a simple asset verification. I had access to databases that could trace the digital and financial footprints of almost anyone in the country. It was a tool of my trade, no different than a law book or a precedent file. With a few keystrokes, I initiated a reverse search on the account number. I typed the numbers that I had memorized, the ones that had been repeating in my sleep. The screen flickered and a name appeared. It was simple, unremarkable. Sarah Jensen. With the name came an address, a tidy little house on a tree-lined street in Portland, Oregon. It was all so clean, so sterile on the screen. Data points, not a life. Social media was the next logical step, the human element. I typed Sarah Jensen, Portland into the search bar, my heart beating a low, heavy drum against my ribs. There she was. The profile was public. Her profile picture showed a woman who looked to be in her late 40s or early 50s, with a warm, open smile and kind eyes. She was standing in a garden, sunlight catching the blonde highlights in her hair. My first feeling was a wave of absurd relief. She looked nice, normal. Maybe there was a simple explanation, a distant cousin, the widow of an old army buddy my father was helping out. I clung to that thought like a drowning woman to a piece of driftwood as I started to scroll. The first dozen pictures were what you'd expect. Photos of her garden, a golden retriever, a book she was reading. And then, there was the girl. Her name was Chloe. She was in almost every other picture. A bright, pretty teenager with her mother's smile and dark, intelligent eyes. I scrolled through years of her life in minutes. Chloe at her 16th birthday party, blowing out candles on a cake. Chloe at a piano recital, her hands poised over the keys. Chloe holding a debate team trophy. With each picture, the knot in my stomach tightened. There was a story here. A rich, happy life unfolding on my screen. I kept scrolling, propelled by a morbid, unstoppable curiosity. I was now a year back in her timeline. It was a 4th of July barbecue, and in the background, standing by the grill with a spatula in his hand and laughing at something someone had said, was my father. The air left my lungs in a single, silent rush. It was him. Unmistakably him. He was wearing a ridiculous Kiss the Cook apron, looking 10 years younger and 1,000 pounds lighter than he did in Chicago. He looked relaxed. He looked happy. He looked at home. I felt a dizzying sense of vertigo, as if the floor of my high-rise office had just dropped away. My hand trembled as I forced myself to keep scrolling. It was a floodgate now. There he was at a Christmas dinner carving a turkey. There he was on a beach, his arm around Sarah Jensen. There he was, beaming in the front row of Chloe's piano recital. Birthday after birthday, holiday after holiday, a complete life I never knew existed. Documented in cheerful, sun-drenched squares on a screen. He wasn't just a visitor. He was a fixture, a family man. I stopped at the most recent photo, posted just 4 months ago in June. It was Chloe's high school graduation. She stood in the center, radiant in a blue cap and gown, clutching a diploma. On her right was Sarah, tears of joy in her eyes. On her left was my father. His hand rested on Chloe's shoulder, his face a perfect portrait of paternal pride. It was the same look he had given me when I graduated from law school, the look that had been the foundation of my entire world. The pride, the love, the unwavering support. It wasn't exclusively mine. It never had been. He had another one, another daughter. In that single, silent moment, the world didn't just crack. It ceased to exist. The 32 years of my life, the perfect family, the unwavering moral compass, it was all a lie. A good lie, perhaps, told with smiles and love and financial support. But a lie, nonetheless. And I was no longer a daughter. I was just the other one. Rage is a fire. It burns hot and fast, demanding action. But what I felt was colder, heavier. It was the weight of ice. For 3 days after discovering the photographs, I went through the motions of my life, my mind a silent, frozen landscape. I didn't plan a confrontation. I didn't rehearse a speech. A fire needs a plan of attack. Ice simply waits for the temperature to drop. The moment came on a Sunday afternoon. I drove to my parents' house under the pretense of returning a book I'd borrowed. The house was quiet, filled with the soft afternoon light that had always made it feel like a sanctuary. My mother was in the garden, a peaceful silhouette among her roses. My father was in his study, the heart of our home, the place where he had designed buildings and I had studied for the bar exam. The perfect stage. I found him reading, a pair of glasses perched on his nose. He looked up and smiled, the same warm, uncomplicated smile from the photographs. "Ava, honey, I didn't know you were coming by." My voice was steady, unnaturally so. "I need to talk to you. Alone." Something in my tone must have cut through the quiet Sunday air, a sliver of the ice I was holding inside. The smile on his face faltered. He took off his glasses and gestured to the chair opposite his desk, the one I had sat in for 1,000 comfortable chats. I didn't sit. Instead, I reached into my bag and pulled out the small stack of 8x10 glossies I'd had printed at a 24-hour photo shop. I laid them on his polished mahogany desk, one by one: the barbecue, the Christmas dinner, the beach, and last, the graduation portrait. He stared at the images, his face turning a pale, ashen gray. The charismatic, confident architect vanished, replaced by a cornered, fragile old man. "What is this?" he whispered, but the words had no conviction. It was the last gasp of a dying lie. I didn't answer. I just stood there, my arms crossed, the prosecutor resting her case. He looked from the smiling girl in the cap and gown back to me, and his composure finally shattered. He slumped back in his leather chair, the air leaving his lungs in a ragged sigh. He put his head in his hands, and for a moment, the only sound in the room was the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall, counting down the seconds of a life that no longer existed. He looked up, his eyes bloodshot. "It started almost 20 years ago," he said, his voice a raw, broken thing. "The story came out in a torrent, a confession held back for 2 decades. Sarah was a project manager on a development in Portland. A lonely business trip had turned into a dinner, the dinner into an affair. It was supposed to be nothing. But then Sarah got pregnant. What was I supposed to do, Ava?" he pleaded, his eyes searching mine for an understanding I didn't have. "She was going to have my child, my daughter. I couldn't abandon her. I couldn't just erase her." He swore he had tried to end it, but every time he looked at Chloe, at this little girl who had his eyes, he couldn't do it. So he built a life around the lie. He created a narrative of business trips and a separate bank account to support them, to give his other daughter the life he felt she deserved. A life of piano lessons, debate teams, and a good school. He leaned forward, his hands clasped on the desk as if in prayer. "You have to understand," he said, his voice dropping to an intimate, conspiratorial whisper. "This never, not for 1 second, changed how I felt about you. Or your mother. I love you both so much. You are my world. This other thing. It was just a situation I had to manage." He was painting himself as the hero of this tragedy, a man burdened by an impossible choice, a man who had sacrificed his own peace of mind to do the right thing for everyone. He wasn't a liar. He was a manager of difficult circumstances. He wasn't a cheat. He was a father twice over. As I listened to him spin his tale of noble suffering, a horrifying clarity washed over me. The ice in my veins began to crack. He wasn't confessing to a crime. He was explaining the logistics of his deception, expecting me, his brilliant lawyer daughter, to appreciate the sheer, difficult architecture of it all. I had expected shouting matches, tears, the dramatic implosion of a family. I had prepared myself for a storm, but the silence that followed his confession was a vacuum, sucking all the air and certainty from the room. He had finished his story, a neat and tidy narrative of his own victimhood, and was now watching me, his lawyer, his daughter, waiting for my verdict. He wasn't just confessing, he was presenting a case, and he expected me to help him find a legal, emotional loophole. I saw then that the man I had worshipped wasn't just a liar. He was a master architect of a reality built for his own comfort, and his confession was just another tool, a tool to manage me. But what do you do when you realize your entire life has been a lie? You brace for the next one. He let the silence hang for a moment longer before leaning forward, his demeanor shifting from penitent to pragmatic. The crisis wasn't the lie itself. The lie was just the backstory. The crisis was now. "Chloe," he began, his voice soft, as if speaking of a saint. "She's a remarkable young woman, Ava, brilliant, top of her class. She reminds me so much of you at that age. The same drive, the same fire." He paused, letting the poisoned compliment land. "She's been accepted to New York University. It's her dream. She wants to be a journalist, to tell the truth." The irony was so thick it was suffocating. He spoke of her with a pure, uncomplicated pride that made my stomach turn. He was building her up, giving her dimension, making her real to me. This wasn't just a mistake. This was a person with a future. And then he laid the final brick of his construction. "The thing is, the economy. My investments haven't performed as I'd hoped these past few years. I've managed to cover her and Sarah's expenses, Her schooling up until now, but NYU, it's a different league. I simply don't have the money to pay for it. He looked down at his hands, a portrait of paternal failure. I felt nothing. The ice in my veins had frozen solid. I knew with the chilling certainty of a prosecutor seeing the final piece of evidence fall into place, what was coming next. This entire performance, the confession, the self-pity, the praise for his other daughter, had all been a preamble to this single, unthinkable point. He looked up, his eyes locking onto mine, the polished mask of the loving father firmly back in place. "I need your help," he said. "I'm asking you to pay for her first year of tuition. Just the first year. $60,000. It would give me time to rearrange my finances, to find a solution. You're the only person in the world I can ask. The only one who can help me." The words hit me with the force of a physical blow. The sheer monumental audacity of it stole my breath. He had shattered my world, invalidated every memory I held dear, and now he was asking me to finance the continuation of his lie with the money I had earned by following the path he had set for me. A hysterical laugh bubbled in my chest. "No," I said. The word was quiet, but it was absolute. Absolutely not. I saw the shift in his eyes. The pleading father vanished, and the desperate, cornered man took his place. He had played his last card, and I had rejected it. Now he would flip the table. "Ava, please, think about what you're saying." His voice was low, urgent, laced with a new, menacing edge. "If I can't pay, Sarah will be desperate. She'll have no choice." He let the threat hang in the air. "She will tell your mother. She will call her, and she will tell her everything." He leaned in, his voice dropping to a whisper that was louder than a shout. "You know your mother. You know her heart. How fragile she is. She lives in this perfect world we've all built for her. The truth, a shock like this, it will literally kill her. Is that what you want?" And there it was, the real request. He wasn't asking for money. He was demanding my complicity. He wasn't asking for help. He was handing me the grenade and telling me that if I didn't hold it for him, he would pull the pin. My choice was no longer about money or principles. He had expertly, cruelly reframed it into a choice between my mother's life and his secret. The brilliant architect had designed his final masterpiece, a perfect, inescapable trap. And he had just locked his daughter inside it. My father hadn't just confessed. He had found himself a new accomplice. Walking out of my father's study was like stepping from one dimension into another. The air in the rest of the house was unchanged, still smelling faintly of lemon polish and my mother's roses. She was in the living room now, humming to herself as she arranged a bowl of freshly cut flowers on the coffee table. She looked up as I entered, her face breaking into an innocent, uncomplicated smile. "There you are," she said, her voice a soft, melodic comfort. "Did you and your father solve the world's problems?" The question was so guileless, so rooted in the reality I had inhabited just an hour before, that it felt like a physical assault. Every nerve in my body screamed. I am a traitor standing in my own home. I was no longer a daughter. I was a co-conspirator. I forced a smile that felt like cracking plaster. Something like that. Just tax stuff. The lie slid out, slick and easy. It was the first of 1,000, I realized. My new life would be built on them. I sat on the sofa, watching her trim the stem of a rose, her movements graceful and sure. We talked for 10 minutes about nothing: the weather, a neighbor's new puppy, a book she was reading. Each casual question she asked felt like a cross-examination. "Are you feeling all right, dear? You look a little pale." Her concern was a hot poker against my skin. How do you look into the eyes of the person you are actively betraying? How do you sit in a room that your father's lies paid for and not scream? I saw then that the perfect world he was so desperate to protect for her was a cage, and he had just handed me the key, demanding I help him keep her locked inside. Later that night, alone in my own apartment, the poison of the secret began its real work, seeping backward in time and tainting everything it touched. I found myself thinking of a family vacation we took to Cape Cod when I was 15. I remembered my father teaching me how to skip stones across the flat gray water, his laughter echoing in the salty air. It had been a perfect day, a memory I had held onto as a touchstone of our family's happiness. But now, the machine in my head replayed the scene with new, horrifying data. I saw him walking away down the beach to take a business call. I saw the moments he was quiet, staring out at the ocean, his thoughts a million miles away. Or perhaps just 2,691 miles away, in Portland. Was he talking to Sarah? Was Chloe a toddler then, learning to walk on a different shore? The perfect memory dissolved into a sick, ugly question mark. The practicalities of his request were a problem my lawyer's mind could actually process. I pulled up my financial statements, the neat columns of numbers representing years of 60-hour work weeks and sacrificed weekends. There it was, the down payment for the apartment I had been dreaming of since I made partner. A sun-filled two-bedroom overlooking Lincoln Park, the culmination of my entire professional life. The number was almost exactly what he had asked for. $60,000. I could do it. I could drain the account, delay my own future, and hand over the money. The transaction itself was simple, but the cost was immeasurable. Paying the money meant I was endorsing the lie. I would be wiring funds to an account belonging to my father's mistress to pay for my half-sister's education. It was an investment, not in her future, but in the architecture of my family's deception. I spent the next few days in a waking nightmare, a ghost in my own life. Every time my phone rang and I saw my mother's name, a jolt of panic shot through me. I imagined telling her, rehearsing the words in my head. I saw the scene unfold, her initial confusion, the slow, dawning horror in her eyes, the sound of her teacup shattering on the floor. I saw her elegant, carefully constructed world collapsing into rubble around her. My father was right about one thing. The truth would be a bomb, and my mother would be standing at the epicenter. But silence? Silence was a different kind of violence. It was a slow-acting poison. To pay the money and keep the secret would mean becoming a permanent sentry, forever guarding the walls of their fraudulent marriage. Every family dinner, every holiday, every shared laugh would be a performance. I would be the keeper of the ugly secret, and in doing so, I would lose myself entirely. My father had presented me with a choice, but it wasn't a choice at all. It was a sentence, and I was being asked to decide on the method of my own execution. There's a specific kind of madness that comes from holding a truth that could shatter everyone you love. My life, once a model of logic and order, became a chaotic internal landscape of hypotheticals and worst-case scenarios. I would be in the middle of a deposition, and my mind would suddenly flash to my mother's face, her expression of disbelief turning to horror. Sleep offered no escape, only nightmares where I was trapped in a house with two identical doors, knowing one led to an explosion and the other to a life of quiet poison. The secret was a living thing inside me, a parasite feeding on my sanity, and I knew, with the kind of certainty that precedes a total collapse, that I was coming undone. The breaking point was a Tuesday morning. I was reviewing a contract, a document I could normally dissect in my sleep, and the words blurred into meaningless symbols. My focus was gone, shattered. I was a liability to my firm, to my clients, and most of all, to myself. That afternoon, I did something I had never done before. I sought professional help. I found the name of a respected therapist, Dr. Anya Sharma, and scheduled an appointment, my voice on the phone sounding like a stranger's. When my mother called later that day, I told her I was just feeling the pressure from a big case. "You work too hard, darling," she said, her voice filled with love and concern, another unintentional twist of the knife. I was already living my father's lie, just on a smaller scale. Dr. Sharma's office was aggressively neutral. Beige walls, abstract art that was meant to be soothing, a plush armchair that felt like a witness box. She was a woman in her 50s with intelligent eyes and a stillness that was both calming and unnerving. She didn't press or pry. She simply created a space with her silence and waited for me to fill it. I had rehearsed my opening statement on the drive over, a strategy to keep myself detached, to present the facts without drowning in the emotion. I was a lawyer presenting a case, nothing more. "I'm here because of a situation a close friend of mine is in," I began, the lie feeling flimsy and absurd in the quiet room. "I'm trying to help her find the best course of action." I laid out the story, using the clinical, detached language of a legal brief. I spoke of Party A, the father, and Party B, the unsuspecting mother. I described the discovery of the second family, the long-term deception, the existence of another daughter. I presented the facts as I knew them, my voice even, my hands clasped tightly in my lap to keep them from trembling. Dr. Sharma listened without interruption, her expression unreadable. She nodded occasionally, a small gesture of encouragement that allowed me to continue, to push through the ugliest parts of the narrative. Finally, I arrived at the central conflict, the impossible demand. Party A has now asked my friend for a significant sum of money to support the other child's education, I said, my throat tightening. I explained the emotional blackmail, the threat that refusing would lead to the truth being revealed to the fragile mother. "So my friend is trapped," I concluded, the professional facade finally cracking. "She either becomes a financial accomplice to a 20-year lie, or she risks destroying her mother's health and happiness. She feels like she's going crazy trying to decide." I fell silent, the story laid bare between us. I had presented the problem in its starkest terms. I expected a discussion of coping mechanisms, of risk analysis, of the psychological toll. I expected her to help me weigh the two terrible options. Instead, after a long, thoughtful pause, Dr. Sharma leaned forward slightly and asked a single, simple question. The question was not what I expected. It was not advice. It was a scalpel. "It's a terrible burden for your friend," she said, her voice calm and even. "But let me ask you this. Whose interests is she actually protecting by staying silent? Is she protecting her mother, who continues to be deceived every single day? Or is she protecting her father, who is trying to avoid the consequences of his own actions?" The words landed in the silent room with the force of a physical impact. They bypassed all my legal arguments, all my emotional justifications, and went straight to the heart of the matter. I had been looking at the equation all wrong. I had been so focused on the potential damage of the truth that I hadn't considered the ongoing damage of the lie. The frame of the problem didn't just shift, it shattered. My father had expertly designed the trap to be about my mother's well-being. Her heart will break. The shock will kill her. But Dr. Sharma's question revealed the trap's true architecture. This wasn't about protecting my mother. My mother was already a victim, a casualty of a war she didn't even know was being fought. Keeping the secret wasn't an act of protection, it was an act of enabling. I would be protecting my father, protecting him from accountability, protecting him from the fallout of his own choices, protecting the comfortable dual life he had so selfishly constructed. In that moment, the $60,000 request was no longer a plea for help. It was the price of my silence. It was the fee for becoming a co-architect in his grand design of deceit. Dr. Sharma's question didn't just echo in my mind, it took up residence, redecorating the entire interior of my thoughts. Whose interests are you actually protecting? The question followed me out of her office and into the sterile light of my own. For days, I had been agonizing over a choice between two horrible outcomes: complicity or destruction. But that was the wrong framework entirely. I wasn't choosing between two paths. I was standing on a bridge my father had built, a bridge that was already on fire, and he was asking me to help him pretend the flames weren't real. My silence wasn't a shield for my mother. It was a fire blanket for him, protecting him from the consequences of the inferno he had started. The realization didn't bring peace. It brought a different kind of torment, a cold, clarifying rage. The abstract problem of the other woman and the other daughter was no longer enough. Before, they were just characters in my father's confession, chess pieces he was moving around a board. But if I was going to burn the whole game to the ground, I needed to see them. I needed to understand who they were. It was late on a Friday night, the city lights of Chicago glittering below my window like a million scattered diamonds. I poured a glass of wine, sat at my laptop, and did the one thing I had resisted until now. It wasn't a calculated legal move. It was an impulse, a compulsion to look directly into the heart of the lie. I typed Chloe Jensen's name into the Instagram search bar. Her profile, like her mother's, was public. It was a bright, vibrant collage of a life lived completely in the open, a stark contrast to the shadowy existence my father had relegated her to. It was a digital diary of an 18-year-old girl on the cusp of everything. There were pictures of her with friends, laughing with pizza and silly filters. There was a picture of a worn copy of a Joan Didion book, with the caption, "Learning from the Master." And then there was the post from 2 months ago, a photo of her, beaming, holding up an acceptance letter, the violet NYU logo prominent. The caption was a breathless, joyful paragraph about how a dream she'd had since she was a little girl was finally coming true, how she couldn't wait to get to the city and start her life, to tell stories that mattered. I scrolled deeper, my wine forgotten. I saw a post from last winter, a picture of her serving meals at a homeless shelter. I saw another of her with the debate team, holding a trophy, her face flushed with victory. She was smart. She was ambitious. She was engaged with the world. She wasn't a phantom or a problem to be managed. She was a real person, a good person by all accounts, who had done nothing wrong except be born into a life built on a foundation of deceit. And then I saw it. A picture from her 18th birthday. She was sitting at a table in front of a cake, and my father was standing behind her, his hands on her shoulders. The look on her face as she gazed up at him. It was a look I knew. It was the look I used to have. It was pure, undiluted adoration. The look of a daughter who believed her father was the greatest man in the world. In that moment, the last vestiges of resentment I felt toward this girl evaporated, replaced by something far more complex and agonizing. It wasn't jealousy. It was a strange, painful, and profound empathy. I wasn't looking at my rival. I was looking in a mirror. A distorted funhouse mirror, but a mirror nonetheless. We were two sides of the same coin, two daughters raised to worship the same false idol. The only difference was that my pedestal had been built in the bright, open sanctuary of a legitimate family, while hers was built in the shadows, visited only on business trips. We were both his daughters, and we had both been lied to. She just didn't know it yet. The villain of this story, the architect of all this pain, finally came into sharp, undeniable focus. It wasn't Sarah. It wasn't Chloe. It was him. And I was done protecting him. Clarity is a quiet thing. It doesn't arrive with a thunderclap, but with a click, like a lock disengaging after a lifetime of being jammed. Looking at Chloe's hopeful, unknowing face on my screen, I saw not an enemy, but a fellow victim. And in that moment, the lock clicked. The complex emotional calculus of my father's making, his pain versus my mother's, my future versus Chloe's, it all dissolved into a single, simple truth. The lie was the disease. The truth, no matter how brutal, was the only possible cure. I was no longer an agonized daughter weighing two impossible choices. I was a surgeon who had identified a cancer and knew, with absolute certainty, that it had to be cut out. There was no other option. I called him the next day. "We need to talk," I said, my voice devoid of the warmth it had always held for him. "Your office, 4 o'clock." There was a pause on the other end of the line, a flicker of surprise that I had dictated the terms. "Of course, Ava, I'll be here." He was trying to sound accommodating, the ever-reasonable father, but I could hear the undertone of anxiety. The balance of power had shifted, and he could feel it. I arrived at his architectural firm at precisely 4. I walked past the scale models of his buildings, the monuments to his success, and entered his private office. He was standing by the window, looking out over the city he had helped to shape. He turned, a practiced, gentle smile on his face, ready to resume his performance of the penitent father. I didn't give him the chance. I remained standing, placing my briefcase on one of the visitor chairs. "I've made my decision," I said, my tone as flat and final as a court ruling. "I will not be paying you $60,000. I will not be paying you anything." His smile faltered. He took a step toward me, his hands outstretched in a pleading gesture. "Ava, honey, please. We can talk about this. Maybe a smaller amount? A loan? Just think about what's at stake. Think about your mother." He was reaching for the same lever of emotional blackmail, the one he believed held absolute power over me. But the lever was no longer connected to anything. I had dismantled the mechanism. "I have been thinking about her," I said, my voice still unnervingly calm. "I've thought of nothing else. And I've realized that every day we keep this secret, we are not protecting her. We are actively deceiving her. You have been deceiving her for 2 decades. I will not be an accessory to that for one more minute." The blood drained from his face as he realized his primary weapon was useless. He tried a different tactic, his voice rising with a note of desperate anger. "You don't understand the complexities, the years. You can't just blow everything up. You'll destroy this family. You'll destroy her." He was the architect, still trying to convince me that the building was sound, that the cracks in the foundation were merely cosmetic. This was it, the moment of detonation. I looked him directly in the eye, the man who had been my North Star, and watched him become a stranger. "I am not going to destroy this family, Dad. You already did that. I'm just turning on the lights so everyone can see the rubble." I took a breath, letting the finality of my decision settle in the quiet, sunlit office. "And that is why this is not just about the money. I am giving you an ultimatum." He stared at me, his mouth slightly agape, a man watching a blueprint he designed spontaneously rewrite itself into something monstrous. "You are going to tell her," I said. "You are going to sit her down and tell her the entire truth. About Sarah, about Chloe, about the last 20 years. I let that sink in before delivering the final blow. "I'm giving you 1 week, 7 days. If you haven't told her by this time next Monday, then I will." The control was no longer his. The secret, his most valuable asset for 2 decades, was no longer his property. I had seized it. The narrative, the timeline, the consequences, they were all mine now. He slumped into his expensive leather chair, looking utterly defeated, a king in a kingdom of lies who had just been served an eviction notice. I turned and walked out of his office without another word. I didn't look back. For the first time in my life, I wasn't his daughter, his lawyer, or his accomplice. I was the architect of what came next. A week is 7 days. It is 168 hours. It is 10,080 minutes. For my father, it was a grace period he treated as a negotiation, a bluff he was certain I wouldn't call. He called me twice, his voice a strained mixture of paternal affection and veiled pleading, talking about the weather, my work, anything but the ticking clock. He was hoping for a crack in my resolve, for the return of the daughter who had always prioritized his comfort. He was waiting for a version of me that no longer existed. For me, that week was a long, slow exhalation, the final expulsion of a lifetime of poisoned air. There was no doubt in my mind. There was no hesitation. There was only the grim, quiet certainty of a necessary demolition. On the 7th day, a Monday, I drove to their house in the late afternoon. The sun was casting long shadows across the manicured lawn, the picture of suburban tranquility. He knew why I was there. The moment I walked in, I saw it in the tightness around his eyes. He had done nothing. My mother was in the kitchen, humming along to a classical station on the radio, arranging appetizers on a platter. Ava, darling, perfect timing. I was just about to open a bottle of wine. Her innocence was a physical pain, a final, beautiful photograph of a world that was about to be set on fire. Mom, can you come into the living room for a minute? I asked. There's something we need to talk about. She followed me, wiping her hands on her apron, her expression one of mild curiosity. My father trailed behind us, a ghost at his own execution. Richard, come join us, I said, my voice leaving no room for argument. He sat in his usual leather armchair, looking smaller than I had ever seen him. My mother settled onto the sofa, patting the cushion next to her for me to sit. I remained standing. Mom, I began, my voice as steady and level as I could make it. What I'm about to tell you is going to be the hardest thing you have ever had to hear, and I am so sorry. Her smile faded, replaced by a look of concern. Ava, you're scaring me. What is it? She glanced at my father, expecting him to intervene, to soften my strange, formal tone. He just stared at his hands. I didn't look at him. I looked only at my mother. I owed her that. For the past 20 years, I said, each word a carefully placed stone, Dad has had another family. The silence that followed was absolute. My mother stared at me, her head tilted slightly as if she hadn't quite heard the words correctly. Then a small, nervous laugh escaped her lips. What? What are you talking about? Is this some kind of bizarre joke? She looked to my father again, a desperate plea in her eyes. Richard, what is she saying? He wouldn't meet her gaze. He just sat there, a monument to cowardice, and in his silence, she found her answer. I watched the stages of realization move across her face like a storm front. The playful disbelief curdled into confusion, then hardened into a dawning, sickening comprehension. He has a daughter, Mom. Her name is Chloe. She's 18 years old. I said it softly, but the words were gunshots in the quiet room. My mother's face, a canvas I had studied my entire life, became unrecognizable. A fault line appeared between her brows, and the elegant, carefully maintained architecture of her composure began to crumble. The blood drained from her face, leaving behind a waxy, translucent pallor. The light in her eyes didn't just dim, it was extinguished. It was as if someone had reached inside of her and turned off a switch. She made a small, wounded sound, a gasp of air from a body that had forgotten how to breathe. The perfect family, the loving marriage, the life she had so carefully curated, it all turned to ash in the space of 10 minutes. She rose from the sofa, her movements stiff and robotic, and looked at the man in the leather chair not with anger, but with the hollow, empty gaze of someone looking at a complete and utter stranger. The war was over. The lie was dead. And we were all just survivors, standing in the ruins. There was no shouting. There were no thrown objects. The great dramatic implosion I had braced for was a silent, bloodless affair. My mother simply stood up, looked at the man who had been her husband for over 30 years, and then walked out of the room. I heard her footsteps on the stairs, then the quiet, precise clicks of a suitcase latch opening and closing. She came back down 10 minutes later, holding a small overnight bag, her car keys in her other hand. She didn't look at him. She looked at me, and in her eyes I saw not betrayal, but a vast, desolate emptiness. "I'm going to my sister's," she said, her voice a fragile, brittle thing, and then she was gone. The front door closed behind her with a soft, final click. My father didn't go after her. He didn't say a word. He just sat in his chair, staring at the empty space where she had been. Then, slowly, he turned his head and looked at me. The grief and shock I might have expected were not there. In their place was a cold, simmering rage. "Well," he said, his voice a low, venomous rasp. "Are you satisfied? You finally did it. You destroyed everything." He didn't wait for an answer. He pushed himself up from the chair and walked into his study, the room where our family's destruction had been confessed and codified. He closed the door behind him, and the lock turning was the loudest sound I had ever heard in that house. He was wrong. I hadn't destroyed everything. I had simply revealed that it was already destroyed. The next few days were a masterclass in silence. The house, which had always been a symbol of warmth and security, became a mausoleum. The air was thick and heavy, each unsaid word a particle of dust in the still air. I stayed, feeling a strange, grim obligation to stand watch over the wreckage I had uncovered. My father remained in his study. I would leave food on a tray outside his door, and hours later, I would find it untouched. The home that had been built on his charisma and my mother's grace was now just a collection of rooms, haunted by the ghost of a family that had never really existed. How quickly a sanctuary becomes a prison when the truth is finally allowed to enter. My phone rang on the third day. It was her. My mother's name glowed on the screen, and my entire body tensed, bracing for the inevitable onslaught of tears, of blame, of regret. This was it. This was the moment my father had warned me about. The moment the fragile woman I had supposedly protected for all these years would finally shatter and point the blame at me. I took a breath and answered. "Hello?" Her voice, when it came, was not what I expected. It was thin, frayed around the edges, but it was clear. There was no hysteria. There was only a profound, weary calm. "Ava," she said, "I'm not calling to yell at you." I waited, unable to speak, my heart hammering against my ribs. "I'm calling," she continued, her voice gaining a sliver of strength, "to thank you." The word hung in the air between us, so utterly unexpected that my mind struggled to process it. Thank me? For detonating her life? "For years," she said, and I could hear the rustle of sheets, picturing her at my aunt's house, wrapped in a borrowed bathrobe. "For years, I felt like something was wrong, a distance I couldn't name, a sadness in him I could never reach. I thought it was me. I thought I wasn't enough." Her voice broke for a moment, a single sharp crack in her composure. "You didn't break my heart, Ava. You just confirmed that it had been broken for a very long time." We talked for almost an hour, and for the first time, it felt like we were actually talking. The polite, comfortable script that had governed our relationship for 32 years was gone, burned away in the fire of the truth. In its place was something raw, painful, but undeniably real. We were no longer just mother and daughter. We were two women, two survivors of the same lie, of the same man's profound and selfish deceit. "He didn't just lie to me," she whispered toward the end of the call, a statement of such devastating clarity it took my breath away. "He lied to you too. He made you grow up inside of it." The pedestal my father had stood on wasn't just empty, it had never existed at all. And for the first time, my mother and I were standing on solid ground together. There are no guidebooks for the day after your world ends. There are only the quiet, practical tasks of sorting through the debris. My new reality became a series of grim administrative duties. Instead of drafting corporate mergers, I was researching divorce attorneys, creating spreadsheets of marital assets, and explaining the cold, hard calculus of a 20-year lie to men who charged $600 an hour. My mother, once the elegant hostess whose biggest concern was the floral arrangement for a dinner party, now sat opposite these men, her back straight, her voice quiet but firm, a porcelain doll that had been dropped and glued back together with steel. She was not the fragile creature my father had used as a shield. She was a survivor, and I was her witness. My father's attempts to communicate were a constant, low-level hum of digital noise. Texts would appear on my phone's lock screen. Pathetic, single-sentence pleas. "Ava, we need to talk." Then came the voicemails, his once commanding voice now wheedling and thin, filled with a self-pity that turned my stomach. "I don't know what to do without you and your mother. You've taken everything. I never listened to them in full." I would see his name, press the number 7 to delete, and move on. Each deleted message was a small act of reclamation, a brick I was laying in the foundation of a new boundary he would never again be allowed to cross. He was the architect of his own ruin, and I was no longer on his construction crew. The chaos had a rhythm, a numbing routine of legal consultations and late-night phone calls with my aunt. And then, on a Tuesday night almost 3 weeks after the explosion, an email appeared in my inbox that did not belong to this new world. It was from a name I recognized with a jolt of ice in my veins: Chloe Jensen. The subject line was just 2 words: "I'm sorry." For a long time, I just stared at it, my mouse hovering over the message. What could she possibly have to say? What new, unimagined circle of hell was I about to be dragged into? I clicked it open, bracing myself for accusations, for anger, for a demand for the money her father had failed to secure. But the words on the screen were not what I expected. The email was short, direct, and stripped of any emotion except a quiet, devastating dignity. "Dear Ava," it began, "my mom told me everything a few weeks ago, about you and your mother, and how you found out. I can't imagine what that must have been like for you, and I am so incredibly sorry that you were put in the middle of a mess you had no part in creating." I read the words again, and then a third time. She was apologizing to me. She went on to explain that her father had called her, distraught, and that she now understood the full context of his financial problems. "I've withdrawn my acceptance to NYU," she wrote. "I'm going to be attending Portland State in the fall. It's a good school, and I can live at home. I think it's for the best. My dream of being a journalist hasn't changed, just the location." There was no self-pity, no hint of blame. It was a simple statement of fact. Then came the final lines, the words that would echo in my mind for weeks to come. "I wanted you to know this so you don't have to worry about it anymore. You don't owe me or my mother anything. My father made his choices. This is just one of the consequences." The email ended there. It was a message of such profound and unexpected grace that it felt like a physical blow. In the middle of all this ugliness, this girl, this stranger who had every right to hate me, had offered not a demand, but an absolution. She had given me a gift I didn't know I needed, a clean, quiet end to one part of a very messy story. A year. They say that time heals all wounds, but that's a lie told by people who have never had to perform surgery on their own soul. Time doesn't heal. It scarifies. It turns the raw, gaping wound into a toughened, silvered mark that you learn to live with. 1 year has passed since the day the lights were turned on, and I am standing on the balcony of my new apartment, a place bought with my own money, built on my own terms. The air coming off Lake Michigan is cool and clean. Below me, the lights of Lincoln Park are a soft, glittering carpet. The quiet here is different from the heavy, suffocating silence of my parents' house. This quiet is mine. It is the sound of a life being built, not a lie being maintained. The divorce is nearly final, a quiet, orderly dismantling of a 30-year partnership. My mother is not the shattered, fragile thing my father predicted. In fact, she is more alive than I have ever seen her. She joined a support group, a circle of women with their own stories of deceit and survival. She calls me after her meetings, her voice stronger than I've ever heard it, full of a newfound curiosity about the world and her place in it. Last week, she showed me a travel brochure. She's planning a 3-week trip to Italy, by herself. "Your father always planned our vacations," she told me, a small, wry smile on her face. I think it's time I saw Florence through my own eyes. She is not a victim. She is a woman who was given a map of a fraudulent country, and she is finally, bravely, drawing her own. My father and I have a relationship that exists in the spaces between words. We speak on the phone every couple of weeks, our conversations circling around the safe, neutral topics of the weather and the stock market. He never mentions my mother, or Chloe, or the life he lost. He is an architect standing in the rubble of a building he designed, refusing to acknowledge the flaws in its foundation. The love I had for him, that towering, monolithic pillar of my identity, is gone. The pedestal is empty forever. What's left is something more complex and far more honest. A sad, bitter, and unconditional connection to the man who gave me life, and who also taught me, in the most brutal way possible, that the truth is the only thing worth building on. I never replied to Chloe's email. There was nothing to say that wouldn't feel clumsy or insufficient. But I think of her sometimes. I hope she is doing well at Portland State. I hope she is writing stories that matter. She exists as a quiet fact in my new reality, a sister I will never know, a testament to the fact that decency can bloom even in the most poisoned soil. Her grace in that moment was a small, unexpected gift, a period at the end of a sentence that allowed me to finally turn the page. She is not a ghost in my life. She is simply a part of a past that I have survived. I run my hand along the cool metal railing of the balcony. This apartment, this view, this quiet. It was all purchased with the money I almost used to pay for another year of my family's great lie. Instead, it became the down payment on my own truth. I am no longer Richard Morgan's brilliant daughter, the reflection of his success. I am Ava, a woman who chose the devastating, liberating, and absolute truth. A woman who is finally, for the first time in her 33 years, standing on a foundation that will not, cannot, be shaken. Because this time, I built it myself.